It did not happen all at once. There was no loud moment, no single break that could be pointed to and named. It began quietly, almost too quietly to notice. At first, it felt like something small had shifted, a tone, a look, a silence where there used to be warmth. They sensed it, but said nothing. Perhaps it was nothing. They thought perhaps it would pass, but it did not pass. Days moved forward, yet something unseen kept slipping away. Conversations became shorter. Spaces once filled with ease began to feel heavy. Even the air around them seemed different, as if it carried a quiet distance they could not touch. Have you ever felt that? When everything appears the same on the outside, yet inside, something no longer rests the way it used to. They try to hold on, not with force, but with quiet patience. Waiting, hopping, watching closely for something familiar to return. A small sign, a soft reassurance. But instead, more things faded. Not suddenly, just enough, each day, to leave them wondering. Was it always like this? Had they simply not noticed before, and so they became still? Not because they had answers, but because they had none. There is a certain kind of silence that does not bring peace. It lingers, it stretches. It asks questions without ever speaking them aloud. That was the silence they found themselves in. They began to listen more than they spoke, not out of wisdom, not yet, but out of wisdom, not yet, but out of uncertainty. Words felt fragile, as if saying the wrong thing might cause what little remained to disappear entirely. So they watched. They noticed the spaces between words, the pauses that lasted a little too long, the way things were said, and the way they were no longer said at all. And slowly, without realizing it, they began to understand something they could not fully explain. Loss does not always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it comes like a fading light, so gradual that you only see the darkness once it has already settled around you. There were moments when they almost spoke, when something inside them rose up, asking to be heard. A question, a feeling, a quiet protest against what was changing. But each time, they held it back. Why? Perhaps they feared the answer. Or perhaps they already knew it. There is a strange kind of awareness that comes before acceptance. A feeling that something is ending, even if no one has said so. It lives quietly in the chest. Heavy but calm, like a truth waiting for its moment. They carried that feeling with them, and as time moved on, what they once held so closely slipped further from their reach. Not taken, not forced away, just no longer there. It left behind a stillness, not empty, but full of unspoken things. In that stillness, they sat with themselves. No distractions, no noise to soften the edges. Only their own thoughts, moving slowly, carefully, as if afraid to disturb what remained. It is in moments like these that something shifts, though it may not be seen at first, because when everything outside begins to fall silent, something inside begins to listen. And perhaps, without knowing it yet, this was where it truly began. At first, they thought the silence would protect them. If they said nothing, perhaps nothing more would be lost. If they remained still, perhaps things would return to how they once were. But silence, when it is born from uncertainty, carries a different weight. It does not soothe. It watches. It waits. They could feel it growing inside them, that quiet tension between what they wanted to say and what they chose to keep hidden. And around them, the world did not pause. Voices continued. Movements went on, but something had changed in the way they were seen. There was a distance now, subtle but undeniable. A quiet shift in the eyes of others, as if a story had been told about them, one they were never invited to hear. Have you ever noticed how quickly people begin to decide when you choose not to explain yourself? They noticed it in small ways. The way conversations seemed to carry a different tone when they entered. The way certain words felt heavier, even when they were not meant for them. The way silence, once shared, now felt like a wall rather than a space. It would have been easy to speak then, to correct what was misunderstood, to explain what they felt, to defend what had never been said out loud. And for a moment, they almost did. The words came close, resting just beneath the surface, clear, ready, waiting. But something held them back. Not fear, not entirely. Something quieter than that. A question. Would it change anything? They had begun to see something they had not seen before. That not every misunderstanding is an accident. That sometimes people hear only what they are ready to hear. And no explanation, no matter how gentle, can reach them. So they stayed quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were beginning to understand that saying it might not matter. This kind of silence feels different. It is not empty. It is not weak. But it is not easy either. It asks you to sit with the discomfort of being seen incorrectly, to feel the weight of words that were never yours, yet somehow placed upon you. And in those moments, something inside begins to shift. At first, it feels like loneliness, a quiet kind, the kind that does not come from being alone, but from not being understood. From standing in a space where your truth exists, but remains unseen by those around you. They felt it deeply. There were times when, pressed against them, asking them to break the silence, to speak just once and set everything straight. But each time they returned to stillness, not as an escape, but as a choice they did not fully understand yet. They began to watch more carefully, not just others, but themselves. Why did the need to explain feel so strong? Why did being misunderstood feel so heavy? And slowly, through quiet observation, they began to see something beneath it all. It was not just about what others thought. It was about something deeper, something more fragile. The desire to be seen clearly, to be known without distortion, to be understood without having to fight for it. But what happens when that understanding never comes? That question lingered, and instead of answering it with words, they allowed it to remain, because in that unanswered space, something unexpected began to form. Not yet strength, not yet clarity, but the beginning of both. A quiet realization, still fragile, still incomplete, that perhaps not every truth needs to be defended. And perhaps Not every silence is a loss. There came a moment, small, almost unnoticeable, when the silence no longer felt like something they were enduring. It began to feel like something they were choosing. At first, this realization was quiet. It did not arrive with certainty or confidence. It simply appeared like a soft shift in the way they saw things. They started to notice the space between what was said and what truly mattered. Before, every word had felt heavy. Every glance carried meaning. Every misunderstanding felt like something that needed to be corrected, softened, explained. But now, something was changing. They began to see that not every voice held the same weight. Not every opinion carried truth. And not every opinion carried truth. And not every moment required their response. It was not indifference. It was not coldness. It was something gentler, something steadier, a kind of awareness. Have you ever realized that the urge to react often comes not from strength, but from discomfort? They saw it clearly now. That quiet pull to speak, to defend, to respond. It was not always about truth. Sometimes it was about easing the unease within. And once they understood that, they paused. Not out of hesitation, but out of clarity. They began to let moments pass without reaching for them. Words drifted by, and for the first time, they did not feel the need to catch them. There is a certain power in that, though it does not feel like power at first. It feels like restraint. It feels like standing still when something inside asks you to move. It feels like holding silence, even when your voice is ready to rise. And yet, within that restraint, something steady begins to form. They started to notice how much of the noise around them had once pulled at their attention. How easily they had been drawn into things that left them unsettled, restless, searching for resolution that never truly came. Now, they watched it from a distance, not with judgment, but with quiet understanding. Some words were not meant to be answered. Some situations were not meant to be carried. Some battles were never theirs to begin with. This did not make everything easier. There were still moments when the old feeling returned, when something inside stirred, asking to be heard, when silence felt heavy again, almost too heavy to hold. But now, they met those moments differently. They did not rush to escape them. They did not rush to fill the space. They simply stayed. And in staying, they began to feel something they had not felt before, a kind of steadiness. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. But it was there, quiet and firm, like something rooted deeper than passing thoughts or shifting a pin. Ions. They were no longer reacting to everything around them. They were choosing when to speak, choosing when to remain still, choosing what truly deserved their energy, and what could be gently left behind. And with each choice, something within them grew clearer. Silence was no longer something that happened to them. It had become something they carried with intention, not as a shield, not as a wall, but as a space where they could see without distortion, a space where they could feel without being pulled apart by every passing moment, a space where their own voice, quiet and steady, could finally be heard. And in that space, they began to understand that strength does not always speak, that clarity does not always explain itself, and that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. And over time, something settled within them. Not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, like still water finding its level after being disturbed. What once felt heavy began to feel light. The need to be understood, to be seen in a certain way, to correct every false impression, it softened. Not because it no longer mattered at all, but because it no longer held power over them. They had seen what happens when you give every voice your attention, how it pulls you away from yourself, little by little, until you are no longer standing where you began. Now, they stood differently. Not distant, not closed, but grounded. There was a quiet confidence in them, though. It did not look like confidence from the outside. It was not in the way they spoke or the way they carried themselves. It was in what they no longer needed. They no longer needed to be right in every moment. They no longer needed to be understood by everyone. They no longer needed to answer every question that was never truly asked. And in releasing those needs, they gained something quieter, but far more lasting. A sense of self that did not shift with every opinion. A calm that did not depend on agreement. A presence that remained, even in silence. Have you ever noticed how peace does not arrive when everything is resolved, but when you no longer feel the need to resolve everything? They began to live in that space, not perfectly, not without moments of doubt, but with a growing awareness that not everything requires their effort. Not everything deserves their response. There is a certain kind of freedom in that. It does not announce itself. It does not ask to be seen. It simply exists, quietly in the way you move through the world. They were no longer watching every word, waiting for something to go wrong. They were no longer holding on to what had already faded. What was gone remained gone, and somehow that was no longer painful. Because in losing what once felt important, they had found something that could not be taken in the same way. They had found themselves without the noise. There is a difference between being silent and being at peace. At first, their silence had been filled with questions, with tension, with things left unsaid. It had been heavy, uncertain, fragile, but now it was different. Now, their silence felt steady. It did not ask for anything. It did not resist anything. It simply was. And within that quiet, there was clarity. They could see things as they were without the need to shape them into something else. They could feel without being overwhelmed. They could stand in a moment without trying to change it. This is where their strength had been forming all along. Not in speaking louder, not in proving anything to anyone, but in learning to remain unchanged by what does not truly belong to them. And so they moved forward, not with noise, not with explanation, but with a quiet understanding that not everything lost is meant to be found again. Some things leave, so that something deeper can remain. And in the end, what remained was enough. not for them to show the world, not for others to finally understand, but for themselves. And in that quiet knowing, they no longer needed anything more.